the Pew at the Pew Charitable Trusts. And I am also on the board of directors of ACC NCR. I don't know, I'm a VP of something. Shannon can tell me exactly, but and have been involved with the pro bono committee for a long time. And Whitman Walker is one of our partner organizations. For those of you who may not know, the ACC NCR does have a specific committee that's dedicated to pro bono work. If you have an interest in joining that committee, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you with the chairs of that committee. And the committee has engaged in some relationships with a number of legal service organizations in the area, Whitman Walker being one of them. And it looks as though we have a pretty good turnout. So unless people think otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our Whitman Walker colleagues. And again, just as an introduction, Whitman Walker Health Services is located in downtown DC. Everybody hears about Whitman Walker Health, but there's also a kick-butt legal services program at Whitman Walker, and they've had a great program for years. And the breadth of the work that they do with the community in Whitman Walker and in DC is just pretty outstanding and amazing. And so what I'm going to do is introduce Amy Nelson, who's the legal director over there, and she will introduce her colleagues, and we will dive into this morning's training.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thanks everyone for having us. We're thrilled to be here. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleagues who will introduce themselves in a moment. Somehow I've messed up my screen completely. Okay, there we go. Okay, better, finally. So good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Big thanks to Kathy and Stephanie and Shannon for their ongoing partnership with us. ACC NCR has been working with Whitman Walker Health for a very long time with our legal department and our pro bono work related to both our name and gender change clinic, which obviously is what we're talking about today, and also connected to our Medicare Part D clinic, which happens at the end of the year. So we appreciate your support and we're thrilled that you're here. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues who will introduce themselves. And I just want to say a big thanks to everyone again.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Pinolini. I use they, them pronouns and go by Liz. I'm a Whitman Walker staff attorney and I run the name and gender change practice. I also am a mentor for all of our wonderful volunteer attorneys. And so thank you all so much for being here today. And I'm looking forward to working with you in the future on some cases.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. Happy Friday. My name is Jess Davis Ritchie, staff attorney at Whitman Walker, they, them pronouns, also a mentoring attorney. So I will be, of course you can reach out to any of us with questions, but we're excited to be working with you all on some of these cases. And yeah, I've been doing this work since 2014 as a intern, and so we've been doing this for a long time, and we couldn't serve all the thousands of people that we have without pro bono help. So we really appreciate you all being here.
And Lee, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Lee Hicks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the operations manager for this amazing team. I help to support them with placing cases with you all. So we will be in touch via email. And thanks so much for sharing your time with us today.
All right, so for today's agenda, what we have on the menu is starting off with some Trans 101 and understanding transgender and non-binary people generally. And then from that, rolling into what it looks like to actually work with clients, not just these communities, but more specifically working with these clients in the context of the name and gender change program. And From there, we will then go into the specific jurisdictional highlights. You've all seen the different trainings for jurisdictions where you're barred. And so really we want to take some time to just highlight the nuances and the specifics that's important to know about those jurisdictions. Once we get through that, we're going to end up just talking through some of the administrative resources that we have for volunteers, and then other resources that we as Whitman Walker Health, as the entire organization, have available to folks. So we're super excited, and let's jump into it without any further ado. However, if folks do have questions throughout the presentation, please do feel free to put something in the text box or raise your hand, and we're happy to call on you and talk in real time. But starting off, understanding trans and non-binary folks. The very first thing to know when you are working with these communities is really just the alphabet itself. You all have, I'm sure, seen the acronym. You've seen different forms of the acronym, whether it's just LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ+. There are a whole lot of different words that we use, and you have lesbian, gay, bisexual or pansexual, trans, non-binary, but the QIA, queer, questioning, intersex, and then asexual or agender folks. So when you think about trans community or like the LGBT community or LGBTQ community, you got to remember that there are a lot of sub-communities within that one overarching theme. And Suzanne posted a question about jurisdictions where we're barred. If you are, it's both where you're barred, but also where your mentor is barred. So if you're a DC bar attorney and working with a Maryland client, that's fine, because I am a Maryland bar attorney, so I can mentor you on that case, and it is all good. But if you have other questions about that, we can talk more specifically offline.
Okay, and transitioning into basic terminology, as Liz mentioned, the alphabet, and so let's get into some of the definitions. So we want to make a key distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. So sexual orientation describes an emotional, physical, and romantic attraction to another person, and so who you are attracted to. And gender identity has to do with the self. It has to do with your internal sense of being male, female, or somewhere else on the gender spectrum. So sexual orientation has to do with your attraction, romantic relationships with others. Gender identity has to do with your identity of yourself. Sex / gender assigned at birth. This is a designation that's written on a person's birth certificate. And this is, made by a doctor at the time of someone's birth. And those standards to make that determination vary state by state. And so finally, gender expression / presentation means how a person chooses to communicate their gender identity to others. And that can be through clothing, hair, styles, mannerisms, and social groups, social interactions that are seen as typically masculine, feminine, or androgynous. So sexual orientation has to do with who you desire, who you are attracted to. Gender identity has to do with self and how you identify as yourself. And gender expression is then how you express that identity to others. And that can, be in all the different forms, but it's not just physically. It can also be just through hair, through your name. Like we all, change up our styles in the way that we want to convey ourselves in public. We're ready for the next one. Thanks, Liz. So some more definitions. When we talk about trans and cis people, what we're saying is so cisgender meaning same. So that's a cisgender person is someone who knows that their gender identity, so how they identify themselves with their gender, aligns with the sex that they were assigned by a doctor at birth, right? So someone else assigns your sex at birth, and if your personal gender identity aligns with that assignment, that is a cisgender person meaning same. So transgender person is someone who knows that their gender identity, who they are, is different from what they were assigned, the gender or sex they were assigned at birth. Intersex is oftentimes thought of as a separate category, and sometimes thought of along with just differences in sexual development. So it's conditions related, intersex is a condition related to the development of genital function and secondary sex characteristics. So it's more commonly thought of as a medical condition and not inherently part of someone's identity. And there is a whole, incredible section of advocacy for intersex children, because that's the point when you're being born and a doctor has to decide and put on a piece of paper what your gender is, but the development of your genitals means that it doesn't clearly fit into those standards that we talked about, where a doctor says, okay, this is male, this is female. It doesn't fall into those lines. And so the doctor and the parents essentially choose for that person. So it is more of a medical consideration, but those considerations tie closely with trans, non-binary, LGBT concerns and discrimination as well. And finally, gender transition. So gender transition, I think, as populace talks about it, is again a medical procedure maybe, or has to do with changing the body, but gender transition is bigger than that, and it's different for every single person. So gender transition defined is the social, medical, and legal processes through which a person changes their gender expression and or physical expression to better match their gender identity. And we'll get into this a little deeper. But just to say, we're listing all these other things besides medical and physical, because gender transition incorporates, can be different for everyone, and doesn't have to be medical or physical at all. It can just be social, it can just be legal, it can just be how you change your clothes and not your name. It's different for every person. So just want to keep that in mind when we talk about gender transition, that every client that you meet is going to be on their own journey, is going to be expressing themselves in their own way. So it's important to not make assumptions based on someone's appearance, because everybody does their gender transition in the way that's best for them.
Next, we want to talk more about non-binary or gender non-conforming folks specifically. This is a very wide category of folks. Like, it really encompasses a lot of different ways that people identify. You'll also hear terms like gender fluid, and so ultimately, people in these categories are people whose gender are not really exclusively male or female. They don't specifically identify in any one particular way. Some folks identify as having no gender, and that's what agender is. Other folks kind of identify as one or the other, depending on how they actually feel, because gender really is fluid. All of these facets of identity are fluid. And I would encourage you to also think back on your own lives and reflect on your own identities and how you have changed throughout the years, how you have identified differently as people, even beyond things like sexual orientation or gender identity. When it comes to non-binary or gender non-conforming folks, its pronouns do vary. The very common one that you hear folks using is they or them, like Jess and I. However, there are some other neopronouns that we'll cover on the next slide. But when it comes to honorifics, that can often be a bit of a challenge for folks. I myself struggle with what I feel like is a good honorific for me. But one that you will commonly hear folks use is MX, pronounced mix. And so with that, it would be like mix Pinolini if I were to use that honorific. But just like with pronouns, preferences when it comes to something like that, or salutations, that will also vary between a person. And so if you're not sure about it, it's always important to ask. And it always being important to ask is going to be a very big thing, particularly with pronouns generally. It is always important to ask people to make sure that you are respecting them and how they identify and the terminology that they use. And in particular, they has been, or the they pronoun has been difficult for some folks, and I can understand it. using they in a singular context can feel a little bit weird when you, like if you're not already familiar with it. It's something that I struggle with, and that's a pronoun that I even use. But the best thing that I can do with encouraging folks on getting used to they as a singular pronoun is just to talk about somebody in that third person using the correct pronoun. Like I met Liz Pinolini at a training. They work at Whitman Walker. Their practice area is name changes. It was nice meeting them. And just kind of saying those things out loud to really reinforce that sort of linguistic pattern to yourself. And even though people might say or think that they as a singular pronoun is a new thing, it really isn't. It actually dates back to, I think, the 14th century. So it's been historically used. It's not a new thing. But the reason all of this is important is because pronouns, just like a person's chosen name, are a critical part of who they are. It's not something that you can assume based on somebody's appearance or mannerisms. And just like a chosen name, they're not preferences. And so those two things, name and pronouns, are, I would say, the cornerstones of understanding and respectfully interacting with queer folks. Because if you can't get their pronoun or their names right, then that person is not going to trust that you'll respect anything else about them. And a good way to normalize the practice of asking around pronouns or sharing that information is introducing yourself using pronouns when you introduce yourself. As you see on our Zoom, our name in the little box, we have Liz Pinolini or Jess Davis Ritchie, and in parentheses, they, them. In our email signatures, we also include pronouns. So little things like that are a great tool to normalize this. The last one that I mentioned is like neopronouns. That's what I'm talking about when we look at the other category at the bottom, Z's and Zer. There are other forms of those. It's really something new that I think is used a bit more by like younger folks, but it's something that is out there and it's important to know about and learn about that. And if those are the pronouns that a person uses, you still have to respect them, even if it sounds weird and unusual to you.
Thanks, Liz. And I was going to add too, at the point at the bottom that says no pronouns, there are oftentimes people who want to just be called by their name. And that is also, I've had to practice that myself. Like, say the person's name was O, and O wants to be referred to as O. And so when you're talking about this person, we're very used to using pronouns. So it involves that practice again, right? Like, O wants to have a meeting. I'm meeting with O at this time. I have to make sure that we have everything that O needs. So it's just the practice of it. Like, no one just knows how to do it. Like, even all of us, Whitman Walker, we're working through the practice as well, and everybody makes mistakes, but putting that time in is invaluable to establishing that trusting relationship, that affirming relationship with clients and colleagues. Okay, so we've talked about, earlier I mentioned people who identify as male, female, or on the spectrum, somewhere on the gender identity spectrum. So when we talk about a spectrum, this is a great graphic to sort of think about. And some people might be familiar with this, but the idea that gender is birth sex, right? We talked about when you're born, a doctor marks, okay, based on the rules of that state, this person is male, this person is female. And with intersex folks, there has to be a decision. It doesn't follow the rules, and the parents decide what that gender will be, and the doctor decides what that gender will be. So you see that intersex is in the middle, and in the middle of the spectrum, and there's a range, right, from intersex to male. There's a range from intersex to female. Same thing with gender identity, right? We would think on one end of the spectrum, there is male, and on the other end of the spectrum is female. And everything in the middle, everywhere in between, is different variations of that, right? It's different hues of that. And so in the center, we have non-binary, where you actually aren't leaning in either direction of towards man or towards male, and you're actually you don't identify with either end of the binary, which is non-binary. or gender expansive, right? Gender fluid, where maybe you're on one end of the spectrum one day and one end of the spectrum on the other day. That's fluidity, right? How you feel in your gender that day. With gender expression, same thing, right? You can have what we have deemed as feminine gender expression. Maybe that's long hair, maybe that's pink, to make it very simple, maybe it's, that's one end, and then the other end is masculine, right? What we deem to be masculine. So a masculine presentation, maybe that's short hair, maybe that's blue. And then in the middle is androgynous. And so that's someone who isn't expressing gender, in either direction, but it's sort of right in the middle of that spectrum. And then we see sexual orientation. Again, this is who you desire, who you're attracted to, who you partner with. And that can be just men, it could be just women, or on somewhere else on that spectrum in between is bisexual, meaning men and women, pansexual, meaning all genders. You're attracted to and you would like to partner with all genders or gender expressions. And then there's asexual, which means you don't want to partner with anyone. So you have that middle section. So you kind of see that there is a range of expression, and all along that line, people identify, right? And that can also change. So it's sort of a good way to visualize it, but not everybody falls on different ends of the spectrum. Okay, and so going back to gender transition, we're just gonna dig a little bit into what we touched on earlier here, a little more of the nuance. So gender transition is, it's really about the individual person's discovery and exploration of themselves, right? Like we all grow up, we're finding ourselves, we're trying to figure out who we are. And so gender transition is a part of that, right? It's by process by which someone comes to understand themselves as being transgender or non-binary. It's that point where they're saying the way that I identify is not aligning with what's on my birth certificate. And what does that mean? How do I identify? How do I then want to express myself to align how I feel with how the world sees me or my documentation, my expression. So it's a personal journey, which means people do it at their own time, at all different kinds of ages. And it's a lifelong thing, right? It's a lifelong exploration. So I think a first step for a lot of people is social transition. And that means maybe first talking about it with a friend, saying, hey, I kind of want to grow my hair out, or I think I want to cut my hair, or I think I want to start changing the way that I dress, or hey, I want you to call me by this name instead now. Or hey, I actually use these pronouns now. So a lot of times that will happen just maybe with your best friend or your close friends or your chosen family or your community. And a lot of times that's where things start, right? So people can feel safe in a lot of cases in doing that personal discovery. And then that can evolve to sharing with family. This can be at work, being asked to be called different pronouns, different names that align more with your gender identity, changing the way you dress, changing your social appearance, wearing makeup, not wearing makeup, all these sorts of things. And like I said, using a new name and pronoun as a social transition. Mind you, we said all of these things and none of these things involve any medical treatment or any physical changes to the body. And so that's often where clients will start. And a lot of clients that we'll work with, obviously they're coming to us for the legal transition. So a lot of folks have started that social transition, but it looks different for everybody. And everyone, at any stage in their discovery, at any stage in their evolution is valid, right? Even if somebody's just starting to say, oh, I think I want to use these pronouns, that's, you don't have to have a final decision. You don't have to make up your mind, at every stage as someone is exploring, that alignment with their identity and how they're seen in the world is valid. So even if someone never gets medical treatment, their transition is valid, right? The way they need to be addressed, their name, their pronouns, what they ask for is what they should receive, right? If they want to be called something, they don't need to change their name legally or do any medical treatment to be called the name they want to be called, to be addressed they want to be addressed. So legal transition is what we'll be working on, which is court order for a name change, gender marker changes, and changing all of their records and ID documents. And finally, we have medical transition, which can include hormone therapy, and also a wide range of surgeries, right? There's not just sort of surgery of genitals, but also surgery of different parts of the body to more align with the presentation that person feels inside that their body doesn't match. So that could be like facial feminizing surgery, that could be electrolysis, just there's a number of things that can be involved. It's not just like a top or a bottom surgery. And like I said before, final reminder that all trans people are entitled to the same dignity and respect, regardless of which transition steps they may have taken, they plan to take, or if they never take those steps, still respecting what people ask to be called.
And even though we are working a lot in this legal realm of changing names and updating identity documents, it is important to still recognize that at the baseline, there is no such thing as a person's legal gender. Though different identity documents have all sorts of different requirements for updating them. We have some information on this later in the slide, but for our local jurisdictions, folks can update their driver's licenses, the gender marker without documentation. They can get an X gender marker. Passport is a similar situation, but for the longest time, you could not get an X or on a passport, and you needed medical documentation. SSA still requires a medical letter to change your gender marker in their database. They do not offer X gender markers, though. USCIS for immigration documents offers male or female and does require medical documentation. Birth certificate requirements are going to vary by state. Most jurisdictions, like our local 3, DC, Maryland, Virginia, only require a medical certification form. But then there are other states like Texas or Ohio that require actually getting a court order saying that your gender is your gender before you can update your birth certificate. So as a result of all these different processes, it's very common for folks to end up having identity documents with inconsistent gender markers. So the ultimate result is that it's inaccurate to conclude that any one document can establish a person's legal gender. And by and large, issues with mismatching identity documents or when you have documents with different gender markers, it doesn't really create legal issues just because your driver's license might have a different gender marker than the one that you get on your passport. That doesn't actually create an issue. Folks are most often concerned about the mismatch when looking at things like air travel, but even then, it doesn't matter if the gender marker on your boarding pass or anything matches the gender on your identification documents. There doesn't need to be a match. The bigger problem with mismatching identity documents is just that mismatching documents are likely to out a person. But as far as the legal effect of that gender marker, there is really only one instance that I can really think of where having a different gender marker can create that sort of more legal-ish issue. And just like legal-ish issue, and that's with health insurance, because sometimes insurance companies will push back just a smidge if you are getting a care that would typically be associated with one gender, but you have a different gender marker. So if you are a man seeking gynecological care, then that an insurance company might take a second look at that, but that's very easily resolved. And in fact, that actually rarely happens anymore because insurance companies are realizing that, hey, trans people exist and they need medical care just like anybody else does. So even in practical terms, there isn't actually that issue with having a different gender marker between like your identity document versus like an insurance card or anything like that. So ultimately, you have a lot of different documents that you need to update, and it's really important to get them all lined up and congruent with each other. But it is common that people do not have that just because of all these different processes. Let's see, got a question about visas. For those questions, Daniel Weir is asking if there are implications like getting a visa for countries hostile to trans rights, or people putting X's on their passport. Are there ethical obligations that would require giving any specific advice if a client were to ask about getting an X on their passport? And I think that that's a really, really interesting question, and something that I've thought about and struggled with myself, because you are getting at a really important point. If you want to travel to like somewhere in the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, or some West African countries like Cameroon or the Democratic Republic of Congo, those countries really do have a bad track record on human rights when it comes to queer communities. And so I think that it is important for a person to understand that, hey, if your passport indicates that you are queer, that might actually put you at risk when it comes to traveling to certain areas. And so if travel is a big consideration for someone, then they may want to consider picking a gender marker that is more visibly congruent with their presentation, so that their document doesn't out them in a way that would make it dangerous for them. So that's a really good question, and I think a really complex thing for a person to really think about, but it is ultimately the person's choice, what feels best to them, what makes the most sense for them, and what they find to be most respectful of their own identity. Let's see. Now, wrapping up this section with some Trans 101 main points. At this point, some of what we've said may feel repetitive, but it's repetitive for a reason. It's really important to internalize all of these things because it's the baseline of working with queer communities. And so the biggest takeaways from understanding trans and non-binary folks is that a person's identity as like their gender identity, who they are, it is completely independent from their sex assigned at birth, and these issues of gender identity need to be completely divested from sexual orientation. As Jess talked about earlier, gender identity is who you are, sexual orientation is the people whom you like. Terminology is going to be different depending on the individual person, but by and large, trans man, trans woman, transgender person, non-binary person, those are all safe terms. A big thing to remember with these terminology is that transgender is an adjective, non-binary is an adjective. They are two separate words. You can shorten transgender to trans, but you can't smush them into one word. Also, a person is not a transgender. Like it's not a noun to use to refer to people. It's not an you can't say that somebody is transgendered. It doesn't work like that. So just stick to like trans and like person, and you'll be good to go. Gender transition itself, as Jess also talked about, consists of many different steps, and people can take all the different steps they want. They might not take certain steps, but no matter of what they do, they are always valid. Their identity is valid and important and needs to always be respected, because that is ultimately the main point. We want to be treated with respect, all of us in this room, and so it's important to make sure that we are treating clients with respect and queer folks with respect. Especially because it's important to keep in mind that queer folks don't always get treated with the respect and dignity that they deserve. So it's important to be able to be that safe space for a person, and that starts with using the correct name, the correct pronouns, and the correct honorifics that a person wants to use.
Thanks, Liz. Great wrap up. So we've addressed the sort of Trans 101 part of it. So now we're going to get into actually working with clients and tips on working with clients. So, first step with the name change clinic process is drafting and signing your retainer agreement with the client. And I know Amy mentioned it in the chat. So in case anybody missed it, we are a pro se empowerment clinic. So there is not an expectation that you are entering your appearance for this client's hearing. What our model is set up is so that an attorney is able to help someone complete the application, a motion to seal, a fee waiver form, help a client gather all of the documents, basically, sort of navigate the hurdles of getting to the point of filing. And then you prepare that person through all the guides and references we have for what they can expect when they file. And then if they have issues after they file, they might follow up with you. You might be able to help them with calling the clerk, something like that. But the idea when you keep in mind is the expectation is that we're helping clients prepare the name change applications and they're filing on their own. If you have capacity, if you're able to, and if you build, we've had other attorneys who have built relationships with clients where then they say, okay, we'd also, we finished the name change, we have a great rapport, I'd love to help you with the gender marker update process. You're more than welcome to expand that representation. Make sure you have that written, but just to sort of make sure we set expectations from the beginning that the expectation is we're empowering clients to file pro se and not entering an appearance in these cases. So we've got the expectations set at the beginning with the client with the retainer agreement. Then you'll complete the relevant forms. In the remote setting, volunteers have done this in different ways. So that might be, first, you want to meet by video if the client has that tech access to sort of introduce yourself, maybe build a rapport, maybe outline the process for them, maybe telling them, hey, we have to get these documents. Do you have a birth certificate? Do you have an ID? Do you need help with finances? So however it works for you, if you're going to be paired or if you're working on your own, developing that relation with the client and getting through the relevant forms in whatever way that works, right? So typically that's going to be a name change petition. We'll talk, you'll see in the trainings about when a client is likely eligible for a fee waiver and when we'll try that. We also have trans-law assistance for folks who need financial assistance but don't qualify for their jurisdiction's fee waiver requirements. So you want to make sure we're talking about how we're going to pay for it in those meetings so that we can get the trans-law assistance ready if they need that. Motions to seal in most cases, because outside of a couple of jurisdictions in Virginia, most of these details, at least the client's address and birth name and chosen name, will be made available online after they file. So we highly recommend motions to seal. They are fairly routinely granted, particularly in DC. And then in Maryland, there's also the motion to waive publication, which is a very straightforward form now with the rule changes in Maryland. That's all in our name change Google Drive. So you'll have templates to all of these things listed here, fillable PDFs ready to go. But those are the things you're going to be looking to check off. You're going to want to make, counseling your client, hey, these are the things that are available, determining what they're eligible for, what they would like to pursue. Then you get your list of documents together and you work on that together. Again, helping the client gather the documents they need. In DC, that's a birth certificate, that's proof of residency, that's a photo ID. So if a client doesn't have a birth certificate in DC, they need to get one, a copy from their local vital records where they were born before they can file. So you want to address these things early so that you can get the ball moving on any supporting documents the client doesn't have before the client files. So once you've completed all of you've decided what forms you're going to do, what you're going to file with the client, you've completed everything, you're going to send that draft petition and all of the supporting docs, basically what you're ready to file, to your mentor for review before giving the client to file in court. So the volunteer will send to the mentoring attorney, and that's why we said, you're going to have a mentoring attorney that's barred in your jurisdiction. So we're going to look through everything, make sure everything's accurate, give you any feedback. And then from there, the client should be ready to file. And then again, the last part is, I always love to give clients, however you like to set it up, but a detailed instructions on what they can expect at the court, where they should go, what they should, what they should be taking, an extra copy, make sure you get a receipt, these sort of little details that pro se folks are less familiar with. And then being there, if they're like, oh, I'm at the courthouse, what's the name? Maybe you're coordinating, hey, let me know the day you're going to file. However you all deem, based on client's capacity, that you can assist once the client has gone to file on their own. And luckily in the pandemic, things have gotten better where we're needing a little less follow-up with the clerks than we did before, but sometimes cases do slip through the cracks, unfortunately. So the client will likely be checking in just about status updates and things like that. And if a client ever has a question for you that you don't know the answer to, always reach out to your mentor, and we can get back to you to facilitate. Okay, and then just another tip on respectful interactions with clients in these initial meetings. And these are just general tips, right? There's, don't ask for pre-transition photos or names, or ask about a person's genitals or medical transit. All of this stuff, as like, even when I say it out loud, I'm like, who would do that? But it happens. And sometimes clients have IDs, obviously they have IDs a lot of times with pictures of them presenting in a way they're not presenting in front of you. So it's like, we don't need to be commenting on, oh, you look good. You look, even when I think people try to do it in a positive way, like, oh, you look so good here. And it's like, we don't need to be commenting on people's appearances, particularly when it comes to old names, old presentations, and, all the supporting documents they're going to be sending you are not updated, right? So I don't think we need to get into those things, but focusing on, the task at hand. If for some reason you need this information, I don't think we will in this setting, but if you do, clearly explain why. It's absolutely necessary. And another part is do not imply that a trans person is being deceptive. And what we mean by that is, I think sometimes people can fall back on saying like, well, what's your real name? And that's inappropriate, right? To say that the person's real name is the name that they're choosing to align with their identity, and that's why they're coming to us. So we want to make sure that we're not using, just like we say, don't use preferred name, because it's not the name they prefer, it's the name they've chosen, right? It's not, they don't prefer if you call them these pronouns, but you can call them something else. It's the pronouns they've chosen. So just, not implying someone's not real, or only something that's biological is real, or what's on your birth certificate is real, like we've talked about. And the next part is really important. Never disclose that a person is trans without their express permission. And I think sometimes, you're working in a clinic and you're working with somebody, and they're like, yeah, I'm trans and I do this and da, 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 and you're like, oh, okay, well, this person's like clearly out, and so I can talk about it with other people because they're out. Don't, right? Like, even if this person is, do not share that a person is trans without their express permission.
One note about why you might need to ask questions about a person's transition. There are some like legally valid reasons when this would come up, particularly things like an insurance appeal for getting coverage for gender affirming or care. Another thing that we deal with very frequently is with immigration, with asylum specifically. If you don't apply for asylum within 1 year of entering the United States, you need to show like changed circumstances in order to be eligible. And a way to do that is through gender transition and these different steps. But if you're not working on a case like that, like just said, who would ask for this information? Definitely stay clear of it and control personal curiosity at all times. If you do, however, make mistakes when it comes to working with folks, it is important to just correct yourself and then move on. Don't dwell on any kind of lengthy apology. Don't turn into an, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, please forgive me, I didn't mean to upset you. Because when you go on to something to that degree, it stops being about the person who like you misgendered or misnamed, and it starts to be about you. And now it's like you're asking the trans person to make you feel better about your own mistake. So just correct yourself, say, I'm sorry, like then use the correct or pronoun or correct name, and then just move on. And even more importantly, it's not just important, or you don't need to just handle your own mistakes. You should also handle the mistakes of colleagues, friends, whomever. If you hear somebody misgender somebody, it's important to correct them regardless of whether or not the person is there. It shows that it's just a really important way of showing respect and that you meaningfully care about the person. And by correcting each other, that's how we learn and get better. And mistakes do happen. So it's okay if you make a mistake here or there, but just be intentional about correcting the mistake and really trying to emphasize in your head the correct name or the correct pronouns. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier with getting used to using they pronouns for a single person. With fee assistance, Jess had also alluded to this a couple slides ago. We always recommend that people file for fee waivers first if they qualify for it. DC is very generous with their fee waivers. Maryland can be a little bit more annoying. They require some documentation and it's a two-step process. But it's not but Maryland, you can still get fee waivers fairly regularly. Virginia tends to be a little bit stingier with fee waivers. And so, but if a person is not able to actually get the costs waived by the court, then we have trans law fee assistance. And so it's a volunteer-led organization. They're the Transgender Legal Advocates of Washington, and they do a lot of great work and help us make sure that cost is never a barrier to name changes and updating identity documents. So if a person expresses need for it, they don't actually need to prove that they have financial need. They just need to ask us for it. There's a very simple 2-page form that they need to fill out and sign. And then you can get it back to either your mentor or follow up directly with Lee Hicks about it. And so the 2 ways that we do trans law fee assistance, we can either assist folks with a prepayment check made out to the court or agency, or we can assist the person with a reimbursement. If they want to go with a reimbursement, then they need to make sure to get a receipt. And also, if they are paying by a card, then they need to also get us a copy of the bank statement showing just the transaction and their name. We don't need to see anything else about a person's financial history or what they're spending their money on. We just need to see the actual specific transaction. Everything else can be redacted or blacked out if the client wants. We recommend that folks go with reimbursement if they are able to, because it can take about 3 to 4 weeks to actually get these checks issued. And so if you needed to do prepayment, we absolutely understand. If that's what you need, we will meet you where you're at, but it will delay a person's ability to actually file. And Kathy also, Kathy mentioned in the chat that they also obtained a grant from ACC to help pay for fees with clients that we're working with, and so those are going to those will go more towards transportation costs. And it's really exciting to also now get to partner with ACC on this as well. And we're looking forward to being able to implement that financial assistance in the near future as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great news. Moving on to section 3, we're going to do jurisdictional highlights. So I understand folks have already seen the training video, so we're just going to go and just do a brief recap for each of the jurisdictions and their applications here. Starting with DC. DC is still our funkiest jurisdiction, even as the courts have gotten themselves together after the pandemic. But they're moving a lot faster than they were before, which is incredible news. So we're making progress. I remain hopeful that we will continue to make progress. Okay, so like we said before in the summary, in DC, you're going to complete the name change application. If the client has any means tested benefits like Medicaid or food stamps or TANF, they should be using the IFP form or fee waiver form. And in DC, for every client, we recommend a motion to seal because DC is notoriously bad for uploading and poorly redacting the entire case file, which can leave clients' phone numbers, emails, addresses, sometimes photo IDs available to the public with an easy court case search. So highly recommend motion to seal in DC. We have an awesome template in our Google Drive for these cases that is routinely granted. Just making sure you're talking with your client about this, about the dangers of having their information available for court case search. And some clients are like, I don't care, who cares? So that's fine too, but we just want to make sure clients are aware that this information does go on DC court case search. And a lot of clients tend to have privacy concerns about that, understandably so. And the next step, really important, is to collect or start the process of collecting the identity and residency documents required. So like we talked about, you're gonna need a birth certificate, you're gonna need a photo ID, and you're gonna need some proof of DC residency. So a lot of times that can take some time for people to get together. So you want to address that early so clients can start the process of getting those things together so they can be ready to file. When you've completed everything, you're gonna file with DC Superior Court. I think right now in person is the best way to file now that the court is open to the public. It has been for some time. We do have the online case file express option still, but we've just had a lot of issues. The court had to create an option for pro se filings in the name change late in 2021 or mid 2021. And so the system is just like not really set up well for what our clients have to do, the online case filing system. So you can do it if you have a client that absolutely can't get into the file in person or can't mail it or whatever it is. You know, you can use that, but just being wary that we have had a lot of issues with it. And there's another note here, just when the client has a fee waiver or motion to seal, those need to be adjudicated before the name change app. So there is an order where first they have to determine if you're proceeding with no fees, then they have to determine if the case is going to proceed under seal, then they get to the name change app. So if a client's in a hurry, maybe you want to talk about taking some of those other steps out, but of course you can address that with your mentor, but there is an order in how those are adjudicated. The next step in DC for any clients with creditors or interested parties, which are identified in the application through the application questions, as soon as the client receives their hearing scheduling notice, they have 10-day window to notify their creditors and interested parties via certified mail. We've had a lot of issues with this in DC because the court is mailing this notice of hearing, and that means the clients are getting it really late and sometimes even after their hearing because of issues with mail. So talk with your mentors if you have this issue, but after the client files, a big thing in DC you want to look out for is that hearing scheduling notice, because the client, if they have creditors, will need to notify them within 10 days of that notice via certified mail. Finally, the client will attend their final hearing via WebEx. They can dial in or they can do video if they have laptop access. This is usually done pro se. If you want to enter your appearance in this case because your client really needs it, you can talk with your mentor about that and next steps. But the final hearing is very straightforward. It's about 5 minutes. They're just confirming the client's identity, that they're not doing the name change for fraudulent purposes, and it's routinely granted. So it's very short. It's a very pro se friendly hearing, and all the instructions are sent with the scheduling order. So the client will have all the dial-in instructions in advance. And then you're just waiting after the hearing, you just wait for the court order, and then you start the identity update process. And here's just a look at the DC name change application. There's a link here to the Google Drive of where you can find this in the DC court folder. DC does not need to be notarized, although there is a box down there. Do not worry about that. E-signatures and the /S/ signatures are okay. And one thing to note here is you'll see the line where it says telephone number in the top box. You want to list here the client's telephone number, semicolon, their email address. And then also if the client has language access needs, you would want to put, needs Spanish language interpretation. This is just the way that we found to most easily notify the clerk of this. So main thing though, you want to have email now post-pandemic. The court has been utilizing email more often. So it's important to include it on this first line here.
And if you find that clients are having an issue with actually getting Spanish language assistance or foreign language assistance from the courts, definitely let us know if they have a legal obligation to do so, and we need to hold them to it. Moving into Maryland name changes, thankfully Maryland and soon to be Virginia, and soon you'll see with Virginia, they're much simpler and more straightforward. Just like DC though, it all starts with a similar sort of documents of completing the name change petition, and for Maryland, their big nuance is publication. Instead of doing direct notice the way that DC does, Maryland law requires you to publish notice of your name change in a newspaper for a couple of weeks. That is an obnoxious requirement. We have never liked it. And the law should be changing later this year to completely remove the publication requirement. But until that happens, we strongly encourage everybody to file motions to waive publication along with their name change petition. And we especially recommend that folks file motions to waive publication because the legislature about a year and a half ago, I want to say at this point, actually enacted a new law requiring that courts waive publication upon motion by the petitioner. So if the petitioner asks for it, they get it. And then not only does it help protect their privacy by not advertising their name change in a newspaper, it also makes the process significantly quicker. And I think that it's because of these waivers of publication that we've seen processing times to go to about a month. Some folks have even gotten their decisions in a couple of weeks in Maryland courts. The other document, just like DC though, is a motion to seal. That is always an important one. We have on the Google Drive the motion to seal. It's a state form, but then we also have an affidavit in support of the motion to seal, and it's important to go through that affidavit with your client. There's a lot of stock information to use in there, but it's important to look at whether or not the client has had specific incidences of harm from their name ever being disclosed or having to show ID with a different name than the one that they use. Courts do want to see those special and like compelling reasons to seal the record. And lastly, there is the fee waiver as well. In Maryland, their nuance with fee waivers is that the first form you file with the initial application is a waiver of prepaid costs. If it's granted at the end of the name change case, once it's granted, you then have to file a second waiver, like final waiver of open costs. And so folks just need to be aware of that. With fee waivers in general, it's important to show some documentation of like what a person's income is, what their expenses are. There's a narrative portion as well that a person can explain their circumstances. It's really important to include this information because if you just put zeros down the board, then the court's probably going to deny it. So even if a person does have zero income and zero expenses, they should still explain their circumstances in that narrative portion. Similarly with DC, once you have all of your documents completed, you want to just make sure that you're reviewing everything and state guide for county specific information to make sure all of your ducks are in a row. Maryland supporting documentation is pretty easy. You only need to include proof of a person's current legal name. So typically a copy of their birth certificate or a driver's license. You do not need to include proof of residency. But once you have that, you file it with the county circuit court for where the person lives. You can do that in person or by mail. And the Maryland, our name change guide has all of the addresses and filing by mail information. And so that's really easy for folks. And once you send everything in within a couple of weeks, or a month, you should get the court order back, and then you can move forward and update your identity documents. Now, moving back to the top, I skipped over gender marker court order, but that's a new thing that Maryland allows folks to do. On the state form itself, there's an option to check if you want the court to issue an order saying that your gender is male, female, or you can even ask them to say it's non-binary. And you don't need to have a court order for gender in most circumstances. Like I had alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, most folks need it for updating birth certificates. If a person, or though sometimes people just want a court order because it is affirming to have a court literally say this person's gender is their gender. That can be an important thing to somebody, but it's not strictly necessary. If they do want to have the court order or gender order as well, then they need to include a letter from their primary care provider certifying that they've had clinically appropriate treatment for gender transition. And we have a copy of that letter on file. If a person is not a Whitman Walker patient, we can give them the letter and let them know how to talk to their provider about it. But if the client is a Whitman Walker patient, let us know and we can follow up with one of our coworkers to get that letter taken care of for the client. But then once you get everything done and have your name change, then you just go forward and update your documents. This is what the Maryland application looks like. The first page, same notes that it doesn't need to be notarized. E-signatures and the /s name is okay. And also just add the client's email next to their phone number. But it's a 2-pager. It's very straightforward and really not a whole lot to talk about with the Maryland application.
Okay, so moving on quickly to Virginia. Virginia, surprisingly, the easiest of them all throughout it all. The name change petition is very straightforward, only a couple of pages. The motion to seal, if the client would like, is also a statewide form from the court. So very straightforward. In Virginia, we'll say the court case search system, and you could always go in and, you know, just Google the client's county in Virginia and look at their court case search system, but it's not that much information. It's certainly not as much as Maryland or Virginia, although the client's name can be available, their address and phone number and those things will not be. So it's less information that's made available to the public in Virginia by far of the 3 jurisdictions, but we do have a motion to seal template if the client is interested, for sure. We've seen in Virginia, when a client files the motion to seal, as in other jurisdictions, the motion to seal needs to be adjudicated first, and that can cause delay. And typically we see in Virginia that a hearing is called when a client files a motion to seal. We've had all of our clients go to these hearings pro se. They've said it's been very respectful, very straightforward. I think mostly in Alexandria and Fairfax and Arlington is where I've seen clients going to these hearings the most. And they said they go in, it's similar to like the name change hearing. It's pro se, the judge is just asking, you know, why did you ask this motion to seal? And the client will have already articulated that in the affidavit of fact. So the client should be able to, you know, recite back to the judge just some simple questions about why they're asking for the motion to seal, their privacy, their fear of being outed. And we have not had any issues with clients obtaining a motion to seal in Virginia. All of this is in the Virginia folder in the NGC Clinic Doc Drive on Google Drive. So you'll have all these templates there if you need them. If you don't have access, of course, reach out to your mentor. So review court and agency updates document. And in the Virginia guide, we have county specific information, just like in Maryland. So if you need the clerk's number, if you need the address, it's all in there in the county specific addendum at the end. The client will file with their county's circuit court where they live, and this can be done by mail. So the client doesn't need to go in person, but they can, because the main difference with Virginia is you do need a notary. So it's a very simple name change application, but the client will need to have a notary. I believe the client can coordinate this with the clerk if they want to go in person, but oftentimes the client's bank will offer free notarization services. And if you all have access to connect the client with a notary, that would also be a helpful addition if the client doesn't have a bank or is unable to go in person, right? Otherwise, these applications can be mailed in, but you just need to get that notary signature. So once you mail everything in, notarized application, the court will just mail the court order to the address that was listed in the application. So it's very straightforward, fairly quick turnaround time in Virginia, and the client will just mail it in, get the court order mailed back to them, and then they're ready to start the gender marker update process. And quick look As we said, this is the majority of the name change application in Virginia. Very straightforward, so pretty quick. Like you said, it must be notarized. That's the one list in Virginia. And make sure to look in the Google Drive. There are some counties that have specific forms, and they're listed there. So when you go into the Virginia Name Change Clinic folder, if you see your client's county listed, you want to make sure you're going into that county specific folder.
All right, before we get into admin and resource stuff to close us out, I want to address a couple of questions in the chat. Daniel posted about template language to help clients who reasonably object to my preferred name language as the reason for name change. Just a note on the legal standard for name changes, it's the common law, and it's pretty much that name changes should be freely given unless they are being sought for some kind of illegal, improper, or fraudulent purpose. So the court really does not look too hard into what the actual reason is. They're only concerned about whether or not you might be trying to escape debt or escape criminal convictions or escape being like on a sex or gun offender registry, stuff like that. But I have never, ever seen a name change get denied. Janet Pelzel also asked if all the forms are self-populating. A couple of the forms, like the DC motion to seal and the Maryland affidavit in support of a motion to seal, are Word documents to edit. The rest of them are all form fillable PDFs. And a couple of the, so you can easily add all the client information. There are a couple of forms that do have some information pre-filled, but those are pretty much going to be the Maryland motion to waive publication. We have the reason for waiving publication filled, and the Maryland motion to seal state form. We have some of that information pre-populated as well. But for resources for volunteers, the one that we've been talking about quite a bit, the NGC Google Drive. One note, please do not share this with clients. These are internal resources for all of our wonderful volunteers. And this is where you can get pretty much all the different things that you will need to work with your client. There is also in the Google Drive a court and agency updates document. It is definitely, I would say, most important for DC cases. It has a lot of really helpful information, though, about all 3 jurisdictions that can answer a lot of questions that you might have about the process. So if you have questions, then the agency updates document is a great place to start. But of course, your Whitman Walker Health Mentor is there for you. We are here to make sure that you feel as supported as you possibly can feel as you go through this work. We can express how much we appreciate your help with working with our clients. You really are what make our name change program so fantastic. And so we want to make sure that we are there for you. The other good resource that we have is a monthly Minutes with the Mentors Zoom call, where we all get together and share any jurisdictional updates. But more importantly, we use this as a time to get together and to share questions with each other and learn from each other, share things that we've, any updates in cases, any issues that we've been seeing, talk with each other about troubleshooting things. And really, it's a great way that we learn from each other to make sure that we are all on the same page and are keeping up with what's happening on the ground. And it's just a good time all around to see folks and hang out for an hour and really talk through some of this stuff. If you have administrative questions as you are going through these processes, getting clients placed with you or anything like that, Lee Hicks is the person you want to talk to. She is the glue that holds us all together. And for clients who have completed the name change process, if they are looking for help with updating identity documents, then that is something that we can help with. As I noted earlier, not everything needs medical documentation. Our driver's licenses and passports have self-attestation and X-gender markers. However, Social Security, USCIS, and birth certificates all require medical documentation. Locally, we do not have non-binary X-gender marker birth certificates, but some states do have them, like in New Jersey and California, and hopefully those things will also change locally. With Social Security specifically, though, we are very happy to share that they are also moving towards self-attestation in the fall and will no longer require gender marker documentation. And they are also exploring ways to update their systems to administratively allow for a next gender marker. So in the near future, we will have Social Security even easier, and we're looking at a future where it's just birth certificates and immigration documents that need medical documentation. But for folks who need help with that, they can be referred to our intake coordinator, Leonor Suarez, or for any legal issues that folks have, you can also refer them to Leonor, and we can do an intake on those separate things. But yeah, we are there to help out.
All right, and just some more information about all of the resources that we have at Whitman Walker for gender affirming care. This is just some information if the clients have questions, just a list of the number of things that we do outside of just the name change process.
So we welcome questions from anyone, whether you want to speak up or put them in the chat or save them for your mentor after you have a case.